The Pacific Ocean, 1942. Vast stretches of blue water hide a brutal contest for supremacy. On one side, the Empire of Japan, proud, battle-hardened, and determined to defend its newly claimed territories. On the other, the United States, mobilizing its unmatched industrial power and preparing to strike back with overwhelming force. Japanese soldiers entered the Pacific battles with confidence. They had conquered Manchuria, rolled through Southeast Asia, and pushed deep into the islands of the Pacific. Their tanks and infantry had proven more than capable against weaker opponents in the early years of the war. Yet, what awaited them in the jungles and beaches ahead was unlike anything they had ever faced before. From the shipyards and factories of America came a machine that symbolized mass production and battlefield dominance, the M4 Sherman tank. Rugged, reliable, and armed with firepower beyond the expectations of Japanese troops. The Sherman would soon become a nightmare for those defending the Pacific Islands as the first Shermans rolled ashore. Japanese soldiers found themselves stunned. Their anti-tank weapons cracked against its armor. Their own light tanks fell apart under its 75mm gun, and their confidence gave way to shock. For many, it was the moment they realized the war had turned, the day steel monsters arrived on their shores. The story of the M4 Sherman begins far from the jungles of the Pacific. In the factories of Detroit, Chicago, and across the American heartland, an industrial miracle was taking shape. The United States understood that to fight a global war, it needed not just brave soldiers, but machines that could be built in massive numbers, repaired easily, and shipped to distant battlefields. The M4 Sherman was born out of this philosophy. Introduced in 1942, it was designed to be versatile, a tank that could move quickly, cross difficult terrain, and carry a powerful 75mm gun. Unlike many other armored vehicles of the era, the Sherman was not built to be the heaviest or the fastest. It was built to be everywhere at once. American engineers gave it thick armor, reliable mechanics, and a gun that could blast through bunkers, light tanks, and fortified positions. Its wide tracks helped it navigate sand, mud, and the dense jungles that would soon become its battlefield. Most importantly, it could be produced by the thousands. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 Shermans rolled out of American factories, a staggering number that no other nation could match. For Japanese soldiers, who were used to lighter tanks with thin armor and smaller weapons, the arrival of the Sherman represented something entirely new. It was not just another tank. It was a symbol of American industrial might, a machine that announced the United States was ready to take the war directly to their doorstep. Before the Pacific War exploded, Japan had already built its own armored force. But the tanks of the Imperial Army were never designed to face a modern industrial enemy like the United States. Instead, they were created with very different wars in mind. In the 1930s, Japan fought campaigns in China and Manchuria. The battles there were often against poorly armed infantry or outdated warlords' forces. For this kind of fighting, Japan produced light and medium tanks that emphasized mobility over armor. The most common was the Type 95 Hago, a small, fast vehicle armed with a 37mm gun and thin armor that could stop rifle fire but little else. Alongside it came the Type 97 Chiha, a medium tank carrying a slightly larger gun, but still lightly protected compared to Western designs. Against Chinese positions, these machines were effective. They could roll over trenches, support infantry, and intimidate opponents who had no comparable armored weapons. Japanese officers became convinced that light, maneuverable tanks were enough for victory. Heavy armor and larger guns were considered unnecessary. Resources were limited, and Japan's industry was already strained by its growing empire, so simple and lightweight designs became the standard. But this confidence created a dangerous illusion. When Japanese crews eventually faced Allied armor, they discovered that their tanks were hopelessly outclassed. What worked on the battlefields of China would prove disastrous against the Shermans waiting for them in the Pacific Islands. The lessons they had failed to learn before the war would cost them dearly in the years to come. The first time Japanese soldiers came face to face with the M4 Sherman, the experience was nothing short of shocking. Until then, they had grown used to fighting enemies with limited armor, light tanks, or armored cars that their guns could penetrate. But in 1943, as the United States pushed deeper into the Pacific, the Shermans began to arrive on the front lines on the island of Tarawa. Marines stormed the beaches with Shermans rumbling beside them. Japanese defenders fired everything they had: rifles, machine guns, and even artillery, but the tanks pressed forward, almost unstoppable. For the men in the bunkers, it felt like steel beasts had landed on their shores. When Japanese tank crews tried to counterattack, the results were devastating. Light Hago tanks rolled into battle only to be torn apart by the Sherman's 75mm gun in seconds. Shells that once destroyed enemy positions in China now simply bounced off the thick American armor. Even when Japanese crews managed to flank their opponents, their weapons lacked the power to do real damage. Survivors later wrote of their disbelief. Some described firing round after round, only to see the American tanks keep moving, crushing through palm trees and concrete positions alike. The first encounters revealed a painful truth. The weapons and tactics that had served Japan in earlier wars were powerless against the new machines America had brought into the Pacific. For Japanese soldiers, the first direct taste of the Sherman's firepower was unforgettable and terrifying. They had entered the Pacific battles expecting their defenses to slow the Americans, perhaps even push them back. But when the Shermans opened fire, those expectations collapsed in an instant. The tank's 75mm gun could shatter bunkers with a single hit. Coconut log fortifications, thought to be nearly indestructible, splintered like matchsticks under its shells. Japanese light tanks, once the pride of the Imperial Army, were blown apart in seconds. Entire crews vanished in fireballs before they even had the chance to strike back. On Saipan and Guam, defenders watched in disbelief as Shermans rolled forward, blasting everything in their path. Soldiers reported that no matter how many times they aimed their anti-tank rifles or light artillery at the American machines, the shells simply bounced off. To them, it seemed less like a battle and more like a slaughter, one where they had no real chance of survival. The shock went beyond the battlefield. Diaries recovered after the war reveal the despair Japanese troops felt when describing the Sherman. One entry reads of a gun crew firing repeatedly, only to watch the enemy tank continue its advance, like a moving fortress. Another account calls the Sherman a demon of steel that defied all logic. These were not just tanks. They were symbols of a crushing new reality. America's firepower was unlike anything Japan had ever faced before. Beyond the clash of steel and fire, the most powerful evidence of the Sherman's impact comes from the words of the men who faced it. Japanese diaries, letters, and reports paint a vivid picture of shock, frustration, and disbelief. They reveal the emotional side of a war where technology and firepower crushed human courage. One soldier wrote of firing his unit's anti-tank gun again and again, only to watch the shells explode harmlessly against a Sherman's armor. "It does not stop," he noted. "It keeps moving, as if nothing has touched it." For him and his comrades, the realization was devastating. Their weapons could not match the power of this new enemy. Another diary from Saipan records the horror of watching Hago tanks destroyed within minutes. Crews that had trained for years were annihilated in their first real battle against American armor. The survivor called the Sherman a giant made of iron and admitted that facing it filled him with helpless anger. Captured reports from Japanese officers show a desperate attempt to find answers. Some recommended suicide charges with explosives, Others called for new tactics of ambush and concealment. But in their own words, these plans were admissions of weakness, an acknowledgement that no conventional weapon they possessed could guarantee victory. Against the Sherman, these testimonies remind us that war is not only fought with machines, but also with human hearts. For the Japanese soldier who saw his best efforts fail, the Sherman was not just a tank. It was the embodiment of an enemy whose power seemed unstoppable. Beyond the clash of steel and fire, the most powerful evidence of the Sherman's impact comes from the words of the men who faced it. Japanese diaries, letters, and reports paint a vivid picture of shock, frustration, and disbelief. They reveal the emotional side of a war where technology and firepower crushed human courage. One soldier wrote of firing his unit's anti-tank gun again and again, only to watch the shells explode harmlessly against a Sherman's armor. It does not stop, he noted. It keeps moving, as if nothing has touched it. For him and his comrades, the realization was devastating. Their weapons could not match the power of this new enemy. Another diary from Saipan records the horror of watching Hago tanks destroyed within minutes. Crews that had trained for years were annihilated in their first real battle against American armor. The survivor called the Sherman a giant made of iron and admitted that facing it filled him with helpless anger. Captured reports from Japanese officers show a desperate attempt to find answers. Some recommended suicide charges with explosives. Others called for new tactics of ambush and concealment. But in their own words, these plans were admissions of weakness, an acknowledgement that no conventional weapon they possessed could guarantee victory. Against the Sherman, these testimonies remind us that war is not only fought with machines, but also with human hearts. For the Japanese soldier who saw his best efforts fail, the Sherman was not just a tank. It was the embodiment of an enemy whose power seemed unstoppable. In June 1944, the island of Saipan became the stage for one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific War. For the United States, capturing Saipan meant securing an airbase close enough for B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese homeland. For Japan, it was a matter of survival. The clash that followed brought the Sherman face-to-face with Japanese armor in a battle unlike any seen before in the Pacific. When U.S. Marines and Army forces landed on Saipan's beaches, Shermans rolled ashore beside them, pushing inland against fierce resistance. The Japanese defenders, well dug in and determined to fight to the last man, launched desperate counterattacks. On June 17th, more than 40 Japanese tanks, including Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chias, charged toward American lines in what became the largest tank battle of the Pacific. The result was devastating. Shermans formed defensive positions, their guns firing rapidly as Japanese tanks advanced across open ground. Within minutes, the lighter armor of the Hago and Chiha began to ignite under direct hits. Japanese crews fought with incredible bravery, some closing in for suicidal attacks, but they could not break through. By the end of the night, nearly every Japanese tank lay burning, while the Sherman stood largely intact. For American troops, Saipan confirmed the Sherman's role as a battle winner. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare realized. Their armor, once considered adequate, had been annihilated in a single engagement. Survivors spoke of the horror of seeing entire formations destroyed in front of their eyes, leaving nothing but wreckage scattered across the fields. The Battle of Saipan not only broke the backbone of Japanese armored forces in the Pacific, it also marked the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat. The island fell, American bombers gained their new base, and the Sherman's reputation as the unstoppable giant of the Pacific was sealed. Only days after Saipan, the islands of Guam and Tinian became the next battlegrounds. Both were heavily fortified, and Japanese defenders were prepared to fight to the death. But just as on Saipan, The arrival of American Shermans changed the course of the battle. On Guam, the terrain was a deadly mix of beaches, jungles, and ridges where Japanese forces had built strong defensive lines. As Marines pushed inland, Shermans provided the crushing firepower needed to clear pillboxes and bunkers. Their guns blasted through concrete, while machine guns swept enemy trenches. When Japanese tanks attempted a counterattack, the Shermans quickly proved their superiority. Light Hago tanks were destroyed almost instantly, their thin armor no match for American shells. Meanwhile, on Tinian, the battle revealed the Shermans' versatility. The island's narrow roads and sugarcane fields could have limited tank movement, but U.S. crews adapted quickly. Shermans supported infantry in coordinated assaults, smashing through Japanese positions that had been prepared for months. Entire cave networks and defensive strongpoints collapsed under sustained bombardment from tank fire and artillery working together. For Japanese soldiers on both islands, the pattern was painfully familiar. Their courage could not overcome the technological imbalance. Every attempt to repel the Americans ended with burning tanks and shattered defenses. Survivors later recalled that the Shermans seemed to appear everywhere at once, advancing slowly but relentlessly until no safe position remained. The victories on Guam and Tinian were not just tactical successes, they were strategic milestones. These islands became vital launching pads for America's next great advance toward the Philippines and, eventually, the Japanese homeland. Once again, the Sherman had proven itself as the spearhead of America's unstoppable push across the Pacific. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific was entering its most brutal phase. The island of Okinawa was the last great barrier before Japan's home islands. Both sides knew that the battle would decide the future. For the United States, victory meant a direct path to Japan. For the defenders, it was a fight for survival. Into this struggle came the Sherman tank, once again at the center of America's advance. Okinawa was unlike the earlier battles. The Japanese had prepared vast networks of caves, bunkers, and hidden artillery across rugged hills. Every ridge was a fortress, every cave an ambush point. The Americans faced a defense designed to bleed them dry. Yet the Sherman proved indispensable in breaking these strongholds. Armed with high explosive shells and supported by flamethrower variants, the tanks blasted open positions that infantry alone could not crack. For Japanese tank crews, Okinawa was the last chance to challenge American armor. But when Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha tanks rolled out, they were quickly destroyed. Shermans outgunned and out-armored them at every turn. Desperate defenders turned to suicide tactics, charging with explosives, throwing mines under tracks, or using concealed artillery. While these attacks caused losses, they never halted the tide. The battlefield became a nightmare of fire and steel. Shermans crawled up ridges under heavy fire, their guns pounding cave mouths and concrete bunkers until they collapsed. Marines advanced behind them, step by bloody step. By the end of the battle, Okinawa was in ruins, and more than 100,000 Japanese defenders were dead. American casualties were staggering too, but the Sherman had once again proven itself as the armored spearhead of victory. Okinawa was the Sherman's final great test in the Pacific. In those desperate weeks, the Japanese soldiers learned what their comrades on Saipan and Guam had already discovered. The firepower and resilience of the Sherman made it an enemy unlike any they had faced before, and one they could not defeat. As the Sherman became the backbone of America's Pacific campaign, Japanese forces scrambled to find ways to stop it. Their own tanks had already proven ineffective, so attention turned to anti-tank weapons and desperate tactics. Yet, even these measures rarely matched the sheer strength of the American machine. The most common weapon was the Type 147mm anti-tank gun. Light and easy to conceal, it could sometimes penetrate the sides of a Sherman at close range. But in practice, the gun's power was limited, and crews often had to wait until tanks were dangerously close before firing. Many gunners never lived long enough to fire a second shot. Other weapons included mines, grenades, and explosive charges. Japanese engineers buried mines along jungle paths and beaches, hoping to cripple Shermans as they advanced. Infantrymen were trained to rush forward with satchel charges, placing explosives directly on the tank's armor. Some even strapped explosives to their bodies in suicide attacks, hurling themselves beneath the moving giants in acts of grim determination. Occasionally, these methods succeeded. A track blown off or an engine disabled could stop a Sherman long enough for other defenses to focus fire. But more often, the tanks pushed forward regardless, supported by infantry and artillery. For every Sherman destroyed, many more rolled on, replacing their fallen companions with relentless momentum. Captured documents reveal the frustration of Japanese commanders. They knew their weapons were inadequate, but with industry strained and resources dwindling, there was no hope of producing more powerful guns or heavier tanks. Instead, they relied on courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity. But against the Sherman, even the bravest efforts often ended in tragedy. The Sherman tank that fought in the Pacific was not a single machine, but a family of variants adapted to the unique challenges of island warfare. American engineers and crews understood that each battle demanded more than just armor and guns. It required innovation. As the campaign moved from one island to the next, new versions of the Sherman appeared, each designed to break through Japanese defenses in different ways. One of the most feared was the flamethrower Sherman. Equipped with a powerful flame projector in place of its main gun, it turned caves and bunkers into death traps. With a single burst, it could unleash streams of fire that reached far into tunnels where defenders believed they were safe. Japanese soldiers called these tanks hell machines, and their psychological impact was as devastating as their physical destruction. Another crucial variant was the Sherman fitted with bulldozer blades. These tanks cleared obstacles, pushed aside wreckage, and even buried enemy positions. On jungle-covered islands, the dozer Shermans carved paths through dense terrain, allowing infantry and other vehicles to follow. They were as much engineers' tools as they were weapons of war. To tackle amphibious assaults, many Shermans were modified with deep wading kits, allowing them to drive straight-off landing craft into waist-deep water. Within minutes, they were fighting on the beaches, providing immediate fire support for Marines under heavy fire. No other tank of the Pacific theater combined such versatility with sheer numbers. Together, these variants transformed the Sherman into more than just a battle tank. It became a multi-purpose war machine, an engine of destruction, support, and survival. Against an enemy already struggling with outdated equipment, the adaptability of the Sherman made Japan's task nearly impossible. Faced with the overwhelming firepower of the Sherman, Japanese commanders sought ways to adapt their battlefield tactics. They knew their own tanks were lighter, slower, and weaker, yet they hoped that clever maneuvers and surprise could overcome the American advantage. But in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, even these tactics rarely succeeded. One of the most common methods was the ambush. Japanese crews concealed their tanks among palm groves, behind ridges, or in camouflage positions, waiting for Shermans to come within range. From these hidden spots, they would strike with their 37 or 47 millimeter guns, aiming for the thinner side armor. At times, a lucky shot could disable a Sherman. But more often, once the Americans spotted the ambush, return fire destroyed the Japanese tanks in seconds. Night attacks were another favored tactic. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese tanks attempted to infiltrate American lines, hoping to cause chaos before retreating. Yet the Shermans, supported by flares, searchlights, and well-trained crews, proved difficult to surprise. Japanese tanks were often caught and destroyed before they could inflict serious damage. Some commanders tried mass charges, sending multiple tanks forward at once in an attempt to overwhelm a single Sherman formation. These assaults, however, often ended in disaster. The Sherman's superior armor and firepower meant that entire Japanese platoons could be wiped out in minutes. The Battle of Saipan demonstrated this clearly, where dozens of Japanese tanks were lost in a single failed counterattack. In the end, Japanese tank tactics reflected a grim reality. Bravery and improvisation could not replace technology. Against the Sherman, every maneuver carried terrible risks, and few brought lasting results. For the men inside those lighter machines, it often meant going into battle knowing that survival was unlikely. War is fought not only with weapons, but also with the human spirit. For Japanese soldiers in the Pacific, the appearance of the Sherman tank struck a blow far deeper than the physical destruction it caused. It was a psychological weapon, a machine that challenged their confidence, their tactics, and even their will to fight. Japanese training had emphasized courage, determination, and the power of the human soul over material strength. Many believed that sheer bravery could overcome any obstacle. But when they faced the Sherman, these ideals collided with reality. Bullets bounced off its armor, artillery shells often failed to stop it, and their own tanks were reduced to burning wrecks within minutes. Every encounter reinforced the same lesson. No amount of courage could match American firepower. Diaries and reports reveal the despair that spread among the defenders. Some soldiers described the Shermans as invincible giants, others as steel demons that defied human effort. Even when a tank was destroyed, dozens more seemed to arrive, rolling steadily forward. The sense of being outnumbered and outclassed weighed heavily on the morale of Japanese troops. This psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Commanders grew increasingly desperate, ordering suicide charges and last-ditch defenses because conventional tactics had failed. Soldiers went into battle knowing that survival was unlikely. Their confidence shattered long before the fight began. For many, the Sherman came to represent not just an enemy tank, but the unstoppable power of America itself that in the Pacific War. The Sherman's greatest weapon was not only its gun or armor, it was the fear it inspired. That fear eroded the spirit of resistance, leaving Japanese defenders exhausted, disheartened, and convinced that victory was slipping beyond their grasp. For the U.S. Marines and Army soldiers who fought across the Pacific, the Sherman was more than just a tank. It was a trusted companion, a shield, and often the difference between life and death. Their accounts reveal not only the machine's strength, but also the brutal conditions under which it fought. Many Marines recalled the relief they felt when Shermans rolled onto the beaches. Under withering fire, infantrymen found cover behind the advancing tanks, following them through surf and sand as the steel giants crushed enemy defenses ahead. One veteran later wrote that the sight of a Sherman beside him gave him the courage to stand and move forward, knowing the tank's gun would silence the pillboxes that rained bullets on their position. For Sherman crews, the experience was equally intense. Inside the cramped hull, temperatures soared in the Pacific heat, and every battle carried the risk of mines, artillery, or hidden ambushes. Yet crews pressed on, knowing that their firepower often made the decisive difference. Gunners described targeting Japanese tanks and watching them erupt in flames after a single hit. Others remembered using high-explosive shells to blast caves and bunkers, clearing the way for the infantry. The bond between Marines and Sherman crews grew strong. Infantry often marked targets for the tanks, while tank commanders used their radios to coordinate with ground forces. In the chaos of battle, this teamwork was vital. One Marine officer called the Sherman "our hammer and our shield," capturing its dual role as both a weapon of offense and a protector of lives. Still, the fighting was never easy. Sherman crews mourned comrades lost to mines, suicide attacks, or hidden artillery. Yet their resolve remained unshaken. For the men who fought inside and alongside these tanks, the Sherman was more than a machine. It was a partner in survival, a symbol of American strength, and a reminder that together they could push through even the most determined defenses. To understand why Japanese soldiers were so astonished by the Sherman, it is important to compare the machines themselves. On paper, the difference between American and Japanese tanks was not just a gap. It was a gulf that grew wider with every battle. The Sherman was classified as a medium tank, weighing around 30 tons. It carried a 75mm main gun, capable of firing both armor-piercing and high-explosive shells. Its armor was up to 75mm thick in places, enough to shrug off most Japanese weapons. Powered by a reliable engine, the Sherman could move at over 25 miles per hour and cross rough terrain with ease. By contrast, the Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank weighed barely 7 tons. Its thin armor, often less than 12mm thick, could be pierced by heavy machine gun fire. Its 37mm gun was completely ineffective against the Sherman's armor. The larger Type 97 Chiha was an improvement, but even its upgraded 47mm cannon struggled to penetrate the Sherman except at very close range and under perfect conditions. Numbers told an even clearer story. The United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, while Japan built only a few thousand tanks of all types combined. American factories could replace losses almost immediately, while Japanese industry struggled to keep pace with the demands of a global conflict, in terms of mobility, firepower, armor, and production capacity. The Sherman outclassed its Japanese opponents in every measurable way. This imbalance meant that battles were rarely contests of equals. Instead, they became demonstrations of how industrial might and technological design could overwhelm courage and determination. For Japanese soldiers, the technical comparison was not just a statistic. It was the harsh reality they faced on the battlefield, an enemy machine they could not match, no matter how hard they tried. By 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive moment. The early victories of Japan were a fading memory, replaced by a relentless American advance. At the heart of this transformation stood the M4 Sherman. Its arrival on the battlefield marked more than just the introduction of a new weapon. It signaled a turning point in the war itself. On Saipan, Guam, and later Okinawa, the Sherman crushed Japanese defenses that had been expected to hold for weeks. Bunkers that once resisted artillery fire crumbled under its shells. Japanese tanks, once symbols of imperial strength, were destroyed in hopeless battles against an enemy they could not match. Each victory carried the Americans closer to Japan's homeland, while each defeat pushed the Japanese further into desperation. The Sherman's impact was not only tactical, but strategic. Its presence allowed U.S. forces to seize critical islands that became stepping stones for bombers and supply lines. With every advance, American air power grew stronger, Japanese supply routes weakened, and the empire's defenses cracked open. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. For Japanese soldiers, the turning point was deeply personal. They saw with their own eyes that bravery and sacrifice could not halt the American tide. Where once they believed the jungle and the ocean would protect them, they now faced a machine that rolled through both with unstoppable force. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was proof that Japan's war could not be won. From this moment onward, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Sherman had helped transform the Pacific War from a struggle for survival into a path toward inevitable Allied victory. The M4 Sherman was more than a machine of war. To both friend and foe, it became a symbol, a rolling embodiment of American power and industrial might. Every time its tracks pressed into Pacific soil, it carried with it not only firepower, but also the message that the United States could build, supply, and sustain a global war effort on a scale Japan could never match. For American troops, the Sherman was a reassuring presence. Its hulking frame, its thunderous gunfire, and its ability to smash through defenses gave soldiers confidence that victory was within reach. Marines who had once feared being cut down on exposed beaches now advanced behind the protective shadow of armored steel. To them, the Sherman was a partner, a guardian, and a promise that no enemy position was truly invincible. For the Japanese, the Sherman carried a darker meaning. It was a reminder of their own industrial weakness. Each encounter showed them that no matter how bravely they fought, they faced a nation that could replace every loss and field weapons on a scale unimaginable to their empire. To the men on the ground, the Sherman was not just another tank. It was the visible face of America's overwhelming strength by the late stages of the war. Even before atomic bombs were dropped, the Sherman had already become a psychological weapon. Its very presence signaled that Japan's defenses would fall, that resistance would be broken, and that America's advance was unstoppable. In this way, the Sherman became more than steel and fire. It became the steel giant that represented the United States itself. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Pacific was scarred by years of brutal fighting. Among the wreckage of ships, planes, and fortifications, the Sherman tank stood out as one of the defining symbols of that struggle. Its legacy in the Pacific was written not only in the victories it secured, but in the memories it left behind. For American veterans, the Sherman became a lasting reminder of survival. Many Marines remembered the tank as the shield that carried them across beaches, through jungles, and into battles that might otherwise have been impossible to win. Even decades later, reunions and memoirs spoke of the comfort they felt when a Sherman rolled into view, its gun pointed forward, clearing the path ahead. For the Japanese, the legacy was very different. Abandoned wrecks of Shermans remained scattered across islands like Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, silent monuments to a war that had turned against them. Survivors remembered the tanks not only as weapons, but as a force that symbolized the crushing weight of American industry and technology. To them, the Sherman was a reminder of a battle they could never hope to win in the years after the war. Many Pacific nations preserved Sherman tanks as memorials. Some stand today in museums and military parks, rusted by time, but still imposing in their presence. They tell the story of a machine that changed the course of battles, shaped the outcome of the Pacific War, and left a permanent mark on history. The Sherman's legacy in the Pacific is not just about destruction, it is about transformation. It represented the turning of the tide, the rise of a new era in warfare, and the enduring reminder that industrial strength and innovation could decide the fate of nations.